Hey friends, Black Girl Tech here. I wanted to talk to you about the difference between being a front-end developer and a back-end developer. Let's just talk about terminology in general. You're going to see a few different terms. You're going to see software engineer, you're going to see front-end developer, you're going to see back-end developer, you're going to see UI engineer, you're going to see web developer. Those are pretty much all different words to describe the same role to some degree. Now, I've read in a couple of places that the distinguishing factor between a developer and an engineer is your formal education. Now, I don't know how true this is. I've seen it said where an engineer is someone who has a formal computer science background, i.e. a degree, and has experience in algorithms and databases, and also can not only apply the practical side of coding, but also the theoretical side of coding, where maybe a developer, not so much. Again, I don't know how true that is, but it may just depend on who you ask or what source you're reading from. I'm going to talk a bit about my titles and what I've had over the years. So I've worked in roles where I've been a developer. I've worked in roles where I've been an engineer. Currently, I call myself a software engineer, even though at my day job here, my formal title is lead UI engineer. So I say I'm a software engineer because throughout my 20-year history in the industry, I have been a full stack engineer. I can work on every tier of the software development lifecycle and the application tier. And not only that, I also doubled as a graphic designer in my spare time over the course of 15 years. I spent some time as a web designer / web developer, and I really was self-taught on the graphical side of things. So I have graphic design experience and user experience. I understand user experience patterns and solving problems from a UX perspective. And working a role, I really like to make it a point to know the job that's directly in front of me and the job that's directly in back of me in the pipeline. So that's usually UX design and product ownership and project management. And I make it a point to basically know how to do both of those jobs so I can do my job more effectively. As a formal UI engineer entitled at my current position, I'm focusing on the UI. I'm not doing any kind of back-end work at the moment, even though I have done it in the past. In the past, I've had roles where I literally was working in the database, writing stored procedures, SQL queries, while at the same time I was working in Photoshop, slicing up mock-ups for front-end development. Given the span of my work history, I call myself a software engineer versus just a developer. That's pretty much that on the terminology. I will say that you may find that depending on the title of the role, developer versus engineer, it may even come with a slight pay scale difference. Roles with developer in the title may not offer as much as roles with the word engineer in the title. So that's something you can look out for and kind of test on your own if you're, looking for jobs right now. Just take a look and maybe on glassdoor.com, or I think it's like salary.com, you can take a look and see if there's really a difference between jobs with the title developer versus jobs with the title of engineer. It'd really be an interesting thing to test out and get concrete data on. I'm not sure if that's ever been done. I'll have to look that up. The difference between a front-end developer / engineer versus a back-end developer / engineer. So as I stated, I'm a UI engineer, which means I work on the front end. So I'm working with tools like JavaScript for the language, as a browser language, client-side language, build tools like Webpack, Grunt, Gulp, CSS frameworks, JavaScript frameworks, Angular, React, Less, Sass. That's my kind of toolkit right now that I'm working with. You can also use the JavaScript language to work on the back end, which is a nice segue to, what is a back end developer doing versus what a front end developer is doing. So for front end development, you're basically working on the client-side experience of an application or website, what the end user is typically going to see. That's who you're coding for. That's who you're solving problems for. That's who you're making sure has a great experience. And that's going to come with good user testing, good UX pattern testing, really honing in on what gives the user the overall best experience in using the product. Now, a back-end developer is going to be working with the data in the database and exposing that data on the server to the client. And back-end developers are going to be working with languages like Java, Python, Ruby, Scala, PHP, and they all have their nuances, their pros, their cons. People are drawn, to them more than others. There's definitely many ways you can go as a back-end developer in choosing which language that you want to work with and, what you can really become good at. Back-end developers also work with frameworks. The Java language has its own frameworks. Python has its own frameworks. They all come with their own set of toolkits that you can use to build an application. And in building that application, you're going to be working on exposing an API that gives the client access to the data on the server. In that tier, a backend developer is going to be doing data transforms to really prep the data and prime it to put it in the format and object that the client side is going to need to have it in. That's also interfacing with the database. Now, this may or may not occur. Some backend positions, you don't really work with the database, and you're kind of more of a middle tier. But in some roles, they do definitely work with the database and they're writing their own SQL queries, stored procedures. Also, backend developers are also going to be working with tools like Apache Tomcat on the server, Nginx, the things with the operating system, Unix, Linux, etc. Depending on which language you're working with is going to kind of determine maybe the application framework or platform on the server side that you're going to be working with. So it may be Tomcat for Java, it may be, Windows, or the Windows operating system for or .NET, etc. So wherever your lane is, being a back-end developer, you can find a lane and you can hone in on it and get really good and find a job that's specific to your lane. Database-wise, there's also many different types of databases that back-end developers are going to be working with. They can work with relational databases like SQL Server, MySQL, or they can work with more document-based databases like Mongo and CouchDB. Again, those are a set of tools and multiple tiers on the back end that backend developers can be working with. So here's the cool thing. If JavaScript is your language of choice, you can both do client-side and server-side development using one language. And you don't have to be skilled in a separate backend language and a separate front-end language to build an application. Using JavaScript and Node.js server side, you can build an application from front to back using JavaScript only. In particular, I think that's the route that I would go these days. I'm going to be completely honest. I'm not interested anymore in learning or using traditional backend languages. In my past experience, I worked with the .NET framework a lot. I did C#, working with the database entity framework, SQL Server, and I left doing that work around 2013, so about 6 years ago. And that's when I decided I wanted to solely focus on front-end work. In that time, Node.js pops up on the scene. So now that gives me the avenue to where I can do my front end and back end developer and still be a full stack engineer using one language. That's just a little bit of the differences between front end and back end development. If you like to know more, there's plenty of resources out there. The most important thing is, if you're looking to get into this industry, choose what's best for you. See where you feel comfortable with, play around with the languages, play around with the frameworks and the tools, and figure out what you feel most passionate about. I would argue that people who are inclined to be UI engineers, there's a very creative aspect to them where they need that visual stimulation. I would argue that they have a little bit of a left brain and right brain situation going on where both are working in tandem, where some other people may be just right-brained and more logical. I know that's how it's been for me. I need the visual aspect of it. I need the graphics portion of it to frankly stay sane and be happy. It took me many years to figure that out. Like I said, I left total backend development in 2013, but I started my career in 1999, and I had kind of dibbled and dabbled with working on the front end and the back end. And then I got to a state where I said, well, you know what? I really don't want to work front to back in all the nuts and bolts anymore. I want to focus on front end development because that's where I'm most comfortable. That's where I'm happy. That's where I'm passionate. Here I am today, and I stay in my lane. So again, choose what's best for you. If you liked what I talked about today, hit the subscribe button below, like, share, and I will see you next time.